The morning of August 7th, 1943 arrived with oppressive humidity that made Commander Toshio Nakamura's uniform cling to his skin as he stood on the deck of the damaged submarine I-17. He had just received orders that would change everything he thought he knew about the war. What he would witness in the coming weeks wouldn't just shake his confidence, it would shatter the very foundation of Japan's belief in victory. Commander Nakamura, a veteran of the Imperial Japanese Navy who had served with distinction since the attack on Pearl Harbor, found himself assigned to a reconnaissance mission that seemed routine on paper. His orders directed him to observe and photograph American supply operations in the Southwest Pacific. Intelligence suggested that understanding the enemy's logistics would provide strategic advantages for upcoming operations. The High Command wanted details, ship counts, supply frequencies, defensive capabilities. What they received instead was a truth so devastating that it would be suppressed for months. The 42-year-old officer had been educated at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in Etajima, where he graduated third in his class in 1922. He had studied naval warfare, strategy, and believed deeply in the spiritual superiority of Japanese forces. Like many of his contemporaries, Nakamura subscribed to the idea that determination and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. The early victories Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Philippines had reinforced this belief. Japan had struck hard and fast, crippling the American Pacific Fleet and seizing vast territories. Surely, the Americans would negotiate peace rather than endure a prolonged, costly war. But something had been troubling Nakamura for months. The Imperial Navy's losses were mounting. At Midway in June of 1942, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, the heart of its naval air power. The Guadalcanal campaign, which began just 2 months after Midway, had become a grinding war of attrition that consumed ships, aircraft, and men at an alarming rate. By the time Nakamura received his reconnaissance orders, the battle for Guadalcanal had been lost, and the Americans were pushing forward with unexpected speed. As I-17 departed from Rabaul in New Britain, Nakamura reviewed intelligence reports in his cramped quarters. The document spoke of American supply convoys, of Liberty ships being built in American shipyards, of growing air superiority. Numbers and statistics filled the pages, but they seemed abstract, almost theoretical. Nakamura had learned to distrust enemy propaganda, and some Japanese intelligence officers dismissed American production claims as exaggerations designed to intimidate. The submarine's mission would take them through dangerous waters. American anti-submarine warfare had improved dramatically since the war's beginning. Several Japanese submarines had been lost in recent months, their crews vanishing without trace into the Pacific depths. Nakamura ensured his crew remained vigilant, running silent whenever possible, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and refresh air supplies. As they navigated southward, passing through the Solomon Islands chain, Nakamura spent hours studying maps and charts. His target was Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, where intelligence suggested the Americans had established a major forward supply base. The plan called for periscope observation during daylight hours, followed by surface reconnaissance at night, if conditions permitted. Photography would be crucial. High Command needed visual evidence to plan future operations. What Commander Nakamura didn't know was that he was about to witness something that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the war, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the morning of August 15th, 1943, Commander Nakamura raised the periscope as I-17 approached the waters off Espiritu Santo. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the Pacific swells. What he saw through the lens made him instinctively pull back, certain that fatigue or equipment malfunction had distorted his vision. He took a breath, composed himself, and looked again. The view remained unchanged and utterly overwhelming. The harbor stretched before him like nothing he had encountered in 2 years of war. Dozens of ships crowded the anchorage, their hulls forming a steel forest that extended to the horizon. Nakamura began counting systematically, as his training demanded. Transport ships, tankers, cargo vessels, destroyer escorts, auxiliary craft. He reached 50 ships and realized he had covered perhaps 1/3 of the visible anchorage. His hands, steady through countless depth charge attacks and combat situations, began to tremble slightly as he adjusted the periscope's magnification. According to historical accounts documented in the Pacific War papers by Donald Goldstein and Catherine Dillon, Japanese officers who witnessed American logistics operations often experienced profound psychological shock that contrasted sharply with their pre-war expectations and training. Nakamura ordered his executive officer, Lieutenant Hideaki Yamada, to take observations and provide an independent count. Yamada, a methodical officer from Osaka who had served aboard destroyers before transferring to submarine service, spent 10 minutes at the periscope before stepping back with visible confusion. "Sir, I count at minimum 87 vessels in the immediate anchorage," he reported quietly. "There are more beyond the headland that I cannot accurately assess. There are also vessels arriving and departing, 3 entering the harbor as I observed." The commander returned to the periscope. What disturbed him more than the number of ships was their condition and organization. These weren't worn, battle-damaged vessels limping into port for desperate repairs. They appeared new, their paint fresh, their movements purposeful and coordinated. Massive cargo booms swung crates and equipment from holds to waiting trucks on newly constructed docks. Fuel lines snaked from tankers to shore facilities. The scale of infrastructure, visible even from several miles offshore, suggested months of construction effort and enormous resource investment. Nakamura had visited Japanese supply bases throughout the Pacific. He remembered the cramped facilities at Rabaul, where damaged ships waited weeks for parts that never arrived. He recalled the fuel shortages that limited training flights and naval operations. At Truk, the Navy's primary forward base, supplies were carefully rationed, and every gallon of fuel, every replacement engine, every spare part was treated as precious and irreplaceable. What he observed at Espiritu Santo operated on an entirely different scale. Through the periscope, he watched as forklifts, machinery he had rarely seen in Japanese facilities, moved pallets of supplies with casual efficiency. Concrete runways extended inland, visible in the distance, with aircraft taking off and landing in regular intervals. The Americans had not simply established a supply point. They had built an industrial complex in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The submarine maintained its position throughout the day, submerged at periscope depth, observing in shifts. Nakamura documented everything: ship types, approximate tonnages, cargo handling rates, defensive positions, patrol boat movements. His training as a naval officer allowed him to estimate the logistical capacity of what he witnessed. The calculations filled him with dread. If this base could support the operations, he observed the continuous arrival and departure of vessels. The stockpiling of supplies visible on the docks, fuel storage tanks dotting the shore, then American logistics, exceeded Japanese intelligence estimates by an order of magnitude. More troubling was the implication: if Espiritu Santo represented merely one forward base among many, then the total American capacity was beyond anything Japan could match. As darkness fell, and I-17 prepared for surface observation, Nakamura sat in his quarters, reviewing the day's notes. His hand paused over the page as he contemplated the war's trajectory. Commander Nakamura ordered I-17 to surface at 2200 hours on August 15th, 1943, as moonless darkness provided cover for closer observation. The submarine's diesel engines coughed to life, and the vessel moved cautiously toward the American anchorage, maintaining a distance of approximately 4 miles from the harbor entrance. What Nakamura witnessed in the tropical night transformed his military assessment into existential dread. The entire coastline blazed with electric light. Floodlights illuminated the docks where cargo operations continued without pause despite the hour. Welding torches sparked like fireflies as work crews made repairs and modifications to vessels. The scale of nighttime activity defied. Nakamura's experienced Japanese bases operated under strict blackout conditions after sunset, conserving fuel and avoiding enemy detection. Here, the Americans worked around the clock with apparent indifference to energy costs or vulnerability. Through binoculars, Nakamura counted additional vessels obscured during daylight hours. Total exceeded 120 ships of various types. More significant was the realization that this represented merely a snapshot. Vessels arrived and departed continuously, suggesting that the number he observed represented only a fraction of the total fleet operating in the region. For every ship at anchor, how many more plied the supply routes between the United States and forward positions? Lieutenant Yamada joined him on the conning tower, equally transfixed by the spectacle. "Sir, I served at Yokosuka before the war," he he said quietly, referring to one of Japan's principal naval bases. At maximum capacity, our facilities could not match what we're observing here. And the Americans built this in how long? 18 months since Guadalcanal? The question haunted Nakamura. Espiritu Santo had been a remote island with minimal infrastructure when Japanese forces controlled the region. The Americans had transformed it into a massive logistics hub in the time it took Japan to rebuild a single aircraft carrier. The implications extended beyond simple industrial capacity. This demonstrated organizational capability, resource abundance, and strategic commitment that Japan could not replicate. Nakamura recalled pre-war assessments that had minimized American fighting spirit and industrial coordination. Japanese military doctrine assumed that democratic societies lacked the unity and dedication for prolonged conflict. The reasoning suggested that early defeats would discourage the American public and lead to negotiated settlement. What Nakamura observed contradicted these assumptions completely. The installation before him represented not merely industrial output but systematic, determined effort to project overwhelming force across thousands of miles of ocean. A signalman interrupted his thoughts. "Commander, we're receiving radio traffic from the harbor. Multiple frequencies, continuous communication. They're not maintaining radio silence." This detail struck Nakamura as significant as the ship counts. Japanese forces operated under strict communication protocols to avoid detection and preserve operational security. The Americans communicated openly. The radio discipline apparently relaxed because they didn't fear Japanese capacity to exploit the intelligence. Whether this represented arrogance or genuine security through overwhelming strength, Nakamura couldn't determine, but both interpretations troubled him. The submarine's photographer, petty officer, First-Class Koji Tanaka, worked throughout the night with a specially modified camera, capturing images of the illuminated base. Each photograph would provide evidence for Nakamura's report, though he wondered whether High Command would believe what the images revealed or dismiss them as propaganda. As I-17 prepared to submerge before dawn, Nakamura took one final look at the American base. A convoy of 6 cargo ships was forming up at the harbor entrance, preparing to depart with the sunrise. Their destination might be Guadalcanal, New Guinea, or any of the advancing American positions. They would offload supplies, then return for more. An endless cycle that Japanese forces seemed powerless to interrupt despite submarine warfare efforts. Nakamura descended into the submarine's interior, his mind calculating grim arithmetic. Japan had begun the war with 63 submarines. Current operational strength was difficult to assess, but losses had been significant. Each Japanese submarine loss represented irreplaceable manufacturing capacity and trained crews. As I-17 moved westward on August 16, 1943, Commander Nakamura sequestered himself in his quarters with charts, intelligence reports, and his own observations. What began as a tactical assessment evolved into something more troubling, a mathematical reckoning that revealed Japan's strategic impossibility. The numbers once assembled told a story that contradicted every optimistic assessment from Tokyo. Nakamura started with ship construction. Before the war, he had read reports estimating American shipbuilding capacity. But those figures had seemed theoretical, divorced from reality. Intelligence suggested the Americans possessed perhaps 4 times Japan's industrial capacity, a significant advantage but not insurmountable if Japanese forces could destroy ships faster than replacements arrived. The calculus depended on maintaining favorable exchange ratios where each Japanese vessel sunk cost the Americans multiple ships. The ships at Espiritu Santo challenged this arithmetic. Many of the cargo vessels appeared to be Liberty ships, the mass-produced transports that American shipyards constructed using prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques. Intelligence reports claimed American shipyards could build a Liberty ship in 42 days. A figure Nakamura had previously dismissed as impossible exaggeration. Japanese shipyards required 6 to 8 months to construct comparable vessels, and that was before material shortages began constraining production. If the American claims proved accurate, and the endless stream of ships suggested they might be, then the exchange ratio required for Japanese victory became impossibly steep. Even if Japanese forces sank 10 American cargo ships for every 1 Japan lost, the Americans could replace their losses faster than Japan could replace its own. The material war of attrition favored the side with greater production capacity, and that advantage appeared to be not marginal, but overwhelming. Nakamura's calculations extended to petroleum. Japan's fuel situation had been precarious from the war's beginning. The American oil embargo had been a primary motivation for attacking Pearl Harbor and seizing the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. By mid-1943, Japan controlled significant oil fields in Borneo and Sumatra, but production, refining, and transport remained bottlenecks. Every drop of fuel consumed by the Navy competed with Army requirements, aviation needs, and industrial consumption. The Americans, by contrast, produced petroleum domestically in staggering quantities. The fields of Texas, California, and Oklahoma supplied not only American military needs, but also supported Allied operations. The floodlights burning at Espiritu Santo represented energy expenditure that would be scandalous waste by Japanese standards. Yet the Americans apparently possessed fuel so abundantly that they could afford such extravagance. Aircraft production presented similar disparities. Before departing Rabaul, Nakamura had spoken with air officers who described growing difficulties replacing lost aircraft and pilots. The Navy's elite aviators, who had trained for years before the war, were being killed faster than training programs could replace them. Veteran pilots died in their zeros, and the replacements arrived with fewer flying hours, less experience, and diminished survival prospects. Through the periscope at Espiritu Santo, Nakamura had observed American aircraft with a regularity that suggested abundant supply. Patrol planes crossed the sky in overlapping patterns, their fuel consumption seemingly unlimited. If the Americans could maintain such intensive air operations at a forward base, their total aviation capacity must be immense. Japanese aircraft production struggled to maintain even current force levels, much less expand to match American growth. Lieutenant Yamada entered with the daily report. "Sir, we intercepted more American radio traffic. They're discussing a supply schedule. Apparently, a convoy arrives at Espiritu Santo every 4 days on average. It's 90 convoys per year at this single location." Nakamura absorbed this information in silence. 90 convoys annually, each comprising multiple ships, delivering supplies to one forward base. How many such bases existed across the Pacific? Guadalcanal, Port Moresby, Fiji, New Caledonia, Samoa each required similar support. The total material flow must be extraordinary, representing industrial mobilization on a scale Japan couldn't approach. Commander Nakamura's disturbing observations aboard Dies 17 in August 1943 occurred against a broader historical context that would validate his concerns. The industrial mobilization of the United States during the Second World War represented perhaps the most dramatic economic transformation in human history, a fact that Japanese planners had catastrophically underestimated when they launched their attack on Pearl Harbor 20 months earlier. The submarine commander couldn't have known the complete statistics; those would emerge only after the war, but the evidence before him suggested dimensions of production that exceeded the Japanese military's most pessimistic assessments. The United States, which had entered the war with a relatively small military establishment, was transforming itself into what would later be called the arsenal of democracy, producing war materiel in quantities that defied comprehension. In the years 1942 through 1945, American shipyards would ultimately construct over 5,000 cargo ships, including approximately 2,700 Liberty ships of the type Nakamura observed at Espiritu Santo. These vessels were built in hundreds of shipyards across the nation, employing workers who had been farmers, shopkeepers, and housewives months earlier. The construction time for Liberty ships would eventually drop to an average of 42 days. With one ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, completed in just 4 days and 15 hours as a demonstration of American industrial capability. Aircraft production revealed similar patterns. In 1941, the United States had produced fewer than 20,000 military aircraft. By 1944, annual production would exceed 96,000 aircraft, an increase that reflected not just expanded capacity, but revolutionary manufacturing techniques adapted from automotive production. The Japanese aircraft industry, constrained by limited resources and traditional craftsmanship approaches, would struggle to produce 28,000 aircraft in its peak year. Nakamura, studying his notes in the submarine's dim interior, had recognized that numbers alone didn't capture the full disparity. Japan fought a resource-constrained war from its inception. Every strategic decision involved trade-offs between competing priorities. Fuel shortages, limited training flights for pilots, reducing their combat effectiveness. Steel allocation favored warships over cargo vessels, creating logistics bottlenecks. Rubber shortages affected everything from aircraft tires to electrical insulation. The Americans, while certainly facing their own resource management challenges, operated with fundamentally different constraints. The continental United States possessed abundant raw materials, energy resources, and manufacturing infrastructure. More significantly, American industrial conversion could draw upon mass production expertise from decades of automotive manufacturing. The same assembly line principles that produced automobiles in Detroit could be adapted to aircraft, ships, and weapons with remarkable efficiency. As I-17 continued westward, maintaining communication silence, Nakamura found himself wrestling with doubts that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. He had been raised in a military culture that emphasized spirit over materiel, where willpower and dedication were considered capable of overcoming mere industrial advantage. The samurai tradition celebrated warriors who achieved victory despite numerical or material inferiority. But modern war, Nakamura increasingly understood, was industrial war. Naval battles were decided not by individual combat prowess, but by radar, aircraft carriers, and code breaking. The side that could replace losses, maintain supply lines, and field technologically advanced equipment held decisive advantages that courage alone couldn't overcome. Japan's early victories had succeeded through surprise, preparation, and fighting against unprepared opponents. As the war extended and American production reached full mobilization, those temporary advantages evaporated. The submarine commander's thoughts turned to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had warned before the war that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict with the United States. Commander Nakamura remembered Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's words with painful clarity as I-17 navigated through contested waters on August 18, 1943. The admiral, who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack and understood both Japan and America better than most senior officers, had warned explicitly about the industrial war that now unfolded across the Pacific. His prophecy, once dismissed by optimistic planners, now seemed tragically prescient. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921 and served as a naval attaché in Washington, experiences that gave him direct exposure to American industrial capacity and national character. Unlike many Imperial Japanese Navy officers who viewed the United States through the lens of racial superiority theories popular in 1930s Japan, Yamamoto recognized American strengths. His famous statement that he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but had utterly no confidence for the second or third years, had proven eerily accurate. The admiral had died on April 18, 1943, just 4 months before Nakamura's reconnaissance mission. American P-38 Lightning fighters, acting on decrypted Japanese communications, had intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville. The loss of Japan's most competent naval strategist, one who understood the war's impossibility, left the Imperial Navy led by officers more willing to embrace desperate optimism over strategic realism. Nakamura had never met Yamamoto personally, but the admiral's reputation permeated the Navy. Officers whispered that Yamamoto had opposed the war initially, understanding that Japan's window of potential victory would close rapidly as American production reached full capacity. The Pearl Harbor attack, devastating as it appeared, had failed to destroy the American aircraft carriers, the capital ships that would dominate Pacific naval warfare. More critically, the attack had united American public opinion in a way that made negotiated peace impossible. In his cramped quarters, Nakamura reflected on how Japanese strategy had depended on assumptions that now seemed naive. The plan had called for rapid territorial expansion, seizing resource-rich regions while establishing a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for America to overcome. Japanese planners assumed that American democracy, with its diverse population and presumed weakness for casualties, would eventually accept a negotiated settlement rather than pay the blood price for total victory. What Nakamura had observed at Espiritu Santo contradicted this entire strategic concept. The Americans weren't negotiating or accepting stalemate. They were building overwhelming force, investing enormous resources into infrastructure and logistics. That suggested commitment to unconditional victory regardless of cost. The defensive perimeter strategy assumed American reluctance to sustain casualties and expend resources, but the evidence before him indicated that America possessed resources so abundant that losses Japan considered catastrophic might be merely acceptable costs to American planners. The submarine's executive officer interrupted his contemplation. "Sir, we're approaching the reconnaissance point near Guadalcanal. Your orders for tomorrow's observation?" Guadalcanal, the name resonated with significance. The 6-month battle for that malaria-infested island had cost Japan thousands of lives, numerous ships, and hundreds of aircraft. The naval battles in Iron Bottom Sound, so named for the ships that littered the seafloor, demonstrated American willingness to fight aggressively and absorb losses. Japan had ultimately abandoned the island in February 1943, a defeat that marked the end of Japanese expansion and the beginning of American offensive operations. "We'll conduct periscope observation of the American facilities at Lunga Point," Nakamura replied. "I need to compare what we saw at Espiritu Santo with their operational bases." That night, Nakamura wrote in his personal journal, a practice he maintained despite regulations discouraging such documentation. The entry revealed his internal conflict. "I have served the Emperor faithfully for 20 years. I have believed in our cause and our inevitable victory. But what I have witnessed these past days forces me to confront truths that are difficult to reconcile with duty. If American capacity is even half of what these observations suggest, then we are not merely disadvantaged. We are attempting the impossible. How does one continue fighting when one knows with mathematical certainty that defeat is inevitable?" The question haunted him through the night as I-17 approached Guadalcanal. On the morning of August 19, 1943, Commander Nakamura raised the periscope off Lunga Point, Guadalcanal, and confronted the transformation of what had been a contested jungle island into a massive American military installation. If Espiritu Santo had shocked him with its scale, Guadalcanal demonstrated the speed with which American engineers could convert hard-won territory into fully operational bases that extended their reach further westward toward Japan's defensive perimeter. The Henderson Field airstrip, which had been the focus of desperate fighting just months earlier, now formed the centerpiece of an extensive air base complex. Nakamura counted aircraft in neat rows: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, more aircraft visible at this single location than currently operational at Rabaul, Japan's primary South Pacific fortress. Revetments protected the planes from air attack, while fuel storage facilities, maintenance hangars, and operations buildings created an infrastructure that rivaled permanent Japanese installations that had taken years to develop. The coastline bore little resemblance to the contested beaches where Imperial Japanese forces had launched desperate nighttime assaults and futile attempts to recapture the airfield. Nakamura had studied those battles. The results had been catastrophic. Japanese infantry, transported by destroyers in what became known as the Tokyo Express supply runs, had repeatedly charged American positions in frontal assaults that resulted in massive casualties, with minimal gains. The Americans, fighting from prepared defensive positions with ample ammunition and fire support, had systematically destroyed attacking forces. Through the periscope, Nakamura observed that the Americans had constructed permanent port facilities at what had been improvised landing beaches. Piers extended into Iron Bottom Sound, accommodating cargo ships that offloaded supplies with mechanical efficiency. Quonset huts, the distinctive half-cylindrical buildings, dotted the landscape in organized rows, housing thousands of personnel. Supply dumps stretched inland, protected by camouflage netting, but visible in sufficient detail to suggest months' worth of stockpiled materiel. What struck Nakamura most forcefully was the sense of permanence. Japanese forward bases maintained a temporary quality, built with the expectation that they might need to be hastily abandoned or that supply difficulties might force evacuation. The American installations at Guadalcanal suggested no such concerns. These were constructed as if the Americans intended to remain indefinitely, investing in infrastructure that would support not merely current operations, but future offensives further up the Solomon Islands chain. Lieutenant Yamada, taking his turn at the periscope, provided additional observations. "Sir, I'm seeing construction equipment working inland: bulldozers, graders, what appears to be road construction. They're expanding beyond the coastal area, developing the interior." The presence of heavy construction equipment reinforced Nakamura's growing understanding of logistical disparity. Japanese forces moved supplies with human labor, muscle power, and limited mechanical assistance. The Americans employed machinery for every task, multiplying individual productivity and enabling construction projects that would be impossible using manual labor. The implications extended beyond immediate military application. This mechanical approach reflected an entire economic system, organized around mass production and mechanization. Nakamura ordered the submarine to maintain observation throughout the day, documenting ship movements and operational tempo. By sunset, his notes revealed that Guadalcanal functioned as a major hub where supplies from rear bases like Espirito Santo were consolidated and redistributed to forward positions. Vessels arrived with predictable regularity, offloaded cargo, and departed a logistics system operating with the reliability of peacetime commercial shipping rather than the improvisation that characterized Japanese supply operations. As darkness approached, Nakamura faced a decision. His orders called for reconnaissance of several locations before returning to Rabaul. Did what additional information would change the fundamental conclusion emerging from his observations? Each base would simply reinforce the same overwhelming reality. American material superiority was not marginal, but absolute. Not temporary, but accelerating. That evening, reviewing photographs and notes, Nakamura calculated tonnage figures that staggered him. I-17 departed Guadalcanal waters on August 20th, 1943, beginning the return voyage to Rabaul with Commander Nakamura carrying intelligence that would fulfill his mission's objectives while simultaneously undermining every optimistic assumption about Japan's strategic position. The submarine's journey westward through the Solomon Islands provided time for reflection. That Nakamura found increasingly burdensome. The knowledge he carried felt less like military intelligence and more like forbidden awareness of inevitable catastrophe. The crew sensed their commander's troubled state. Submariners developed acute sensitivity to leadership mood in the confined spaces where men lived meters apart, breathing recycled air and sharing constant danger. Nakamura maintained professional demeanor during inspections and operational decisions, but Lieutenant Yamada, who had served with him for 8 months, noticed the change. The commander spent long hours reviewing photographs and notes, making calculations that filled pages with figures that seemed to bring no satisfaction, only deepening concern. During the return voyage, I-17 operated under strict protocols designed to maximize survival probability in waters increasingly dominated by American anti-submarine capabilities. The submarine surfaced only at night for battery charging, remaining submerged during daylight hours. Allied aircraft patrolled constantly, and radar-equipped destroyers hunted Japanese submarines with improving effectiveness. Several boats had disappeared in recent months, their fate unknown but presumed destroyed by depth charges or air attack. On August 23rd, while running submerged during daylight, I-17 detected distant explosions depth charges being dropped on a suspected submarine contact several miles away. Whether the target was another Japanese boat or simply a false contact, the sounds served as a reminder of the dangers that surrounded them. Nakamura listened to the explosions through the hull, each detonation a reminder of how precarious Japan's position had become. The Americans could afford to drop depth charges on uncertain contacts, expending explosives in quantities that reflected abundant supply. Japanese forces, by contrast, rationed munitions carefully, unable to waste ordnance on anything less than confirmed targets. The submarine's passage near the Japanese base at Buka, on the northern tip of Bougainville, provided opportunity for observation that highlighted contrasts with American facilities. Buka operated with visible strain-damaged aircraft awaiting parts, supply vessels arriving irregularly, defensive positions manned by garrison forces that appeared undernourished and poorly equipped. The base served its function but barely, sustained through improvisation rather than systematic logistics. Nakamura realized that the disparity extended beyond simple production numbers. American forces benefited from organizational systems that efficiently transported supplies from factories to frontline positions. The logistics chain functioned reliably enough that forward commanders could plan operations confident that fuel, ammunition, and food would arrive as needed. Japanese logistics, by contrast, suffered constant disruption from submarine attacks, air raids, and insufficient transport capacity. Frontline units often operated on starvation rations, with ammunition shortages preventing effective defensive preparations. As I-17 approached Rabaul on August 26, Nakamura prepared his report, knowing it would be read by officers who might not welcome its implications. The Japanese military culture discouraged pessimism, emphasizing fighting spirit and offensive determination. Officers who voiced doubt about ultimate victory risked being labeled defeatists, potentially ending their careers or worse. Yet Nakamura felt duty-bound to report accurately, to provide intelligence that reflected observed reality rather than comforting fiction. He drafted 2 versions of his report. The first official version documented observations in factual terms, ship counts, facility descriptions, operational assessments. The language remained professional and objective, presenting data without explicit strategic conclusions. This report would satisfy formal requirements and provide intelligence value for tactical planning. The second version, intended for trusted colleagues and potentially senior officers who might appreciate frank assessment, drew explicit conclusions. This version stated plainly that American material superiority exceeded Japan's capacity to overcome through fighting spirit or tactical excellence. I-17 surfaced in Rabaul Harbor on the evening of August 27, 1943, returning Commander Nakamura to a base that seemed diminished after witnessing American installations. Simpson Harbor, once considered an excellent natural anchorage and Japan's most important South Pacific position, now appeared vulnerable and inadequate. The volcanic peaks surrounding the harbor, which should have provided defensive advantages, instead seemed to trap Japanese forces in a location increasingly isolated as American forces advanced up the Solomons chain. Nakamura reported immediately to the intelligence section of the Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters, where his photographs and documentation would be analyzed. The initial reception was professional intelligence officers valued first-hand reconnaissance from experienced commanders. But as Nakamura began describing the scale of American operations at Espirito Santo and Guadalcanal, he detected skepticism among some listeners. One staff officer, a captain who had never served aboard submarines, questioned whether Nakamura might have overcounted vessels or misidentified ships. "Perhaps, Commander, fatigue or limited visibility affected your observations," the captain suggested diplomatically. "Intelligence estimates suggest American supply operations, while substantial, remain within manageable parameters. If the numbers you report were accurate, it would suggest industrial capacity that seems implausible." Nakamura maintained composure, though the dismissal frustrated him. "Sir, I have included photographs that corroborate the counts. My executive officer conducted independent observations that confirmed my assessments. The American logistics capacity exceeds our previous estimates significantly. This is not subjective impression but documented reality." The meeting concluded with assurances that Nakamura's report would receive thorough analysis and appropriate distribution. But the commander left headquarters with the distinct impression that portions of his intelligence might be softened or contextualized in ways that made the findings less alarming to senior leadership. The Japanese military bureaucracy, like most large organizations, tended to filter information upward, emphasizing data that confirmed existing plans, while minimizing evidence that challenged strategic assumptions. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Ito, an old Naval Academy classmate, found Nakamura that evening at the officers' mess. Ito served on the Southeast Area Fleet staff and could speak more candidly than those at the formal debriefing. Oversake in a quiet corner of the mess hall, Ito provided context that explained the skeptical reception. "Your report arrives at an awkward moment," Ito explained quietly. "High Command is planning offensive operations intended to regain initiative. Your intelligence suggests those operations face difficulties that commanders prefer not to acknowledge. There's institutional pressure to maintain confidence, to avoid defeatist thinking that might affect morale." Nakamura sipped his sake thoughtfully. "But if our planning is based on inaccurate assessments of enemy capabilities, we're simply setting up more defeats. How does maintaining false optimism serve the empire?" Ito's expression reflected the weariness of someone who had wrestled with similar questions. "You're asking me to explain decisions made by officers far senior to both of us. I can only observe that organizations under stress often resist information that challenges their existing worldview. Your report demands acknowledging that our fundamental strategy may be flawed. That's not a message anyone wants to deliver to Tokyo." The conversation touched on Admiral Yamamoto's death months earlier. Ito suggested that Yamamoto had possessed sufficient prestige and strategic understanding to potentially redirect Japanese war planning had he survived. Without his leadership, the Navy faced a vacuum where no single officer commanded the respect necessary to advocate for dramatic strategic revision. "What would you recommend if you had the authority?" Ito asked. "Given what you observed, what should Japan do?" Nakamura considered the question carefully. What he was about to say could be considered defeatism if reported to the wrong ears. But Ito was trustworthy, and the Sheikh had loosened his caution. Honestly, seek negotiated settlement before American forces close the distance to the home islands. The war becomes more costly for both sides the longer it continues, but ultimately, America can bear those costs, and Japan cannot. 3 months after Commander Nakamura's reconnaissance mission. In November 1943, American forces landed at Bougainville, continuing their advance toward Rabaul and rendering the Japanese base increasingly isolated. By the time the war ended in August 1945, American industrial mobilization had produced the crushing material superiority that Nakamura had first witnessed at Espiritu Santo. The statistics compiled after Japan's surrender validated his observations with sobering precision. The United States ultimately built 6,777 naval vessels during the war years, including dozens of aircraft carriers, both fleet carriers and escort carriers produced in quantities that Japan could never approach. American shipyards constructed Liberty ships and Victory ships at average rates of 3 per day at peak production. The comparison to Japanese capacity was stark. Japan completed approximately 600 naval vessels during the same period, struggling to replace losses while American production accelerated continuously. Aircraft production revealed similar disparities. America manufactured approximately 300,000 aircraft between 1941 and 1945, while Japan produced approximately 76,000 aircraft total. More critically, American aircraft technology advanced throughout the war, with newer models consistently outperforming Japanese counterparts. The Zero fighter, which had dominated Pacific skies in 1942, became increasingly obsolete as American Hellcats, Corsairs, and Mustangs entered service with superior performance, armor, and firepower. Commander Nakamura survived the war, though his submarine I-17 did not. The vessel was lost with all hands on August 19, 1943. Ironically, same day Nakamura had been observing Guadalcanal, though in different waters on a subsequent mission. Nakamura himself had transferred to staff positions by that point. His intelligence experience was utilized in increasingly desperate defensive planning as American forces advanced toward the home islands. In the post-war years, Nakamura rarely spoke publicly about his reconnaissance mission or the conclusions he had drawn in August 1943. Like many Japanese veterans, he struggled with the knowledge that the war had been unwinnable from its inception, that the sacrifices and casualties had occurred in service of impossible objectives. The photograph of Espiritu Santo Harbor, with its forest of American ships, haunted him. That single image had revealed truth that years of fighting would only confirm. Historians studying Japan's defeat have noted that numerous indicators predicted the outcome that Nakamura observed firsthand. American gross domestic product in 1943 exceeded Japan's by approximately 10-1. American steel production was roughly 12 times Japanese output. The United States produced more than twice as much oil in 1 year as Japan captured in the entire East Indies during its occupation. Its statistics, abstract when presented as numbers, became concrete reality when manifested as ships, aircraft, and supplies that overwhelmed Japanese forces through sheer material abundance. What Nakamura had witnessed was not merely American industrial capacity, but the application of that capacity with systematic efficiency. The United States mobilized its economy for total war while simultaneously maintaining civilian living standards that would have seemed luxurious by Japanese standards. American civilians experienced rationing and shortages, certainly, but never the starvation and desperate privation that Japanese citizens endured as the war progressed. This disparity reflected resource abundance that Japan, even controlling much of East Asia, could not match. The question that haunted Nakamura in his later years was whether earlier recognition of this disparity might have altered Japan's course. If his report had reached decision-makers who acted on its implications, Could Japan have sought negotiated settlement before the firebombing campaigns and atomic weapons? The question was unanswerable, but inescapable. He had seen the truth in August 1943. But truth alone was insufficient to change the trajectory of nations committed to total war. Commander Toshio Nakamura died in 1983, exactly 40 years after his reconnaissance mission. Among his papers, family members found the second version of his report, the frank assessment, that had never been officially submitted. The final paragraph captured the essence of his realization. I have observed the enemy's supply base and recognized that we face not merely a powerful opponent, but an industrial colossus whose capacity exceeds our own by margins that cannot be overcome through courage or sacrifice. Japan must reckon with this reality or face destruction. Fighting spirit cannot sink ships that outnumber our fleet 10-1. The harbor at Espirito Santo continued operating through the war's end, ultimately facilitating the movement of supplies and personnel that contributed to Japan's defeat. Today, the waters where Commander Nakamura observed the American fleet remain, though the ships have long since departed and the installations have returned to tropical vegetation. The historical significance resides not in the physical location, but in what one Japanese officer recognized when he saw it, a truth so overwhelming that it shattered illusions and revealed the mathematics of inevitable defeat.